Viewer contributions make local programming possible on WNIN. Become a member of WNIN with your contribution so we can continue to make this programming available. Visit WNIN.org and click on the donate button.
With historic flooding happening nationally, we'll take a look at the risk in our region and what you should do when there's a flash flood warning. That's up next on WNIN Newsmakers. Welcome to WNIN Newsmakers. I'm Noah Alatza, Chief Communications Officer for the University of Evansville. We've all seen the images of devastating flash flooding in Texas and on the East Coast recently. So what are the chances of something like that happening in our area? We are now joined by Wayne Hart, Chief Meteorologist for WEHT and WTVW Eyewitness News. Wayne, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here, Noah.
It's always great to see you, former
see
colleague.
You yes.
So a few weeks ago, the area had, significant flash flood warnings. Is that rare for our region?
Well, what we went through in June on the north and west sides of Evansville was almost historic. I would say it was probably a once in a 10-year event.
Wow.
And maybe even 20 years. Talking to some people who got flooded out, they had never seen that kind of water in their neighborhoods. The airport had a little over 3 inches in 3 hours, but we had unofficial reports from those neighborhoods of 5 inches of rain in 3 hours.
Unbelievable.
And that was just from a line of storms. It was just cell after cell was training, just like a boxcar, a train of boxcars, just dumping heavy rain over the same location. And the sewers and the drainage, they couldn't handle that. And so we haven't seen that kind of flooding in Evansville in quite a while.
And obviously, we think, rain contributes to flash flooding. What other factors, though, come into play when things really start to flood? I know you mentioned the sewer system.
Oh, yeah.
What comes into play with all of that?
Well, we know certain parts of the city flood worse than others. Southeast side has had issues over the years, the aqueducts on the west side. So that's where it kind of makes it tricky when it comes to putting a warning out, because we know the heavy rain is falling. But say an inch of rain in an hour in one part of town is going to have a different impact than it would in another part of town, just depending on how well things drain. And we're in an old city, and obviously our sewage system, the drains through the neighborhoods are not what they could be, but that's typical for a city this old. And so we have those issues, and that's when it's important for us to get reports of what's happening, because we know it's raining heavy, we're just not quite sure what it's doing out there.
And I'm curious, when you mentioned the southeast side, are there of the city of Evansville, are there areas though in other parts of the tri-state that might be more prone to flash flooding? You think of West Kentucky maybe?
Yeah. It's more
areas?
Urban flooding for us. I mean, other parts of the area, especially Western Kentucky, have to worry about river flooding like we saw back in the spring. Long rain or long-term heavy rain events, and I think this spring it was over 10 inches of rain in 3 days that caused all the creeks, rivers, and streams to go over their banks and cause, in some cases, catastrophic flooding in parts of Western Kentucky. So that's a little different. That's what generally they have to worry about there. But for most of us here in the metro, it's just urban flooding, and we see that in Owensboro also. It's a city that can't really handle a lot of rain in a short period of time.
We saw what happened in Texas around the 4th of July. Conceivably, though, is that type of catastrophic flooding, is that even possible? Could that happen here in the tri-state?
Not likely, because that was a hilly area of central Texas, and it was occurring on a somewhat dry riverbed. And so obviously when you have rivers and creeks running down hills, that can accelerate the water. And in the case of the hill country there in central Texas, a few weeks ago, it was relatively dry. So as that heavy rain hit the ground was almost like concrete. So it didn't soak in, it just rushed down, and what was a small creek or river all of a sudden was a raging torrent of deadly flooding. So we don't have enough elevation around here for that to be an issue. Now you get to eastern Kentucky, yes, but not so much here in the tri-state.
Can you walk our viewers at home through the kind of watch and warning process? How and when are they issued?
Well, the watch is issued hopefully a day or two ahead of time, and they all come from the National Weather Service. You know, as a TV meteorologist, I can talk about, I think flooding could be an issue, but the actual watches and warnings come from the Weather Service. And for Evansville and most of our area, it's the Paducah office. And so they will identify heavy rain threat, and they were all over the event in the spring over Western Kentucky. The models were advertising that several days in advance. So they had flood watches out, and it was upper end, like this is really going to be bad. This is not just your average flash flood that's going to happen, and indeed it turned out that way. And so as the event is unfolding, that's when the warning is issued. But it's not quite the same as, say, a severe storm or a tornado, where we know there's a tornado, we kind of know what direction it's moving, and everything in that path is going to be impacted. But when it's heavy rain, like I said earlier, some areas will be impacted more than others. So that's why it's not a heavy rain warning, it's a flash flood warning, depending on just how your area is handling that amount of rain. And so that's where the Weather Service really relies on emergency management. And we have what's called a chat system where all the EMA managers and staff, along with broadcast meteorologists, can communicate. And during an event like that, they'll say, yeah, we're starting to get roads underwater on the west side of Evansville. And then they'll put the warning out based on that. I mean, some cases, it's pretty obvious. You're getting just torrents of rain, and you know there's going to be flash flooding. But it's those borderline cases where you're not quite sure if it's a situation that warrants a warning.
A lot goes behind the scenes, you know, behind the curtain that people often don't see when they see you get up on the evening news. How can people, you know, aside from watching you, Wayne, how can they stay aware of local weather warnings? Is it?
Well, in this era, you have, everybody's got a smartphone. So, you know, we have our weather app, and there's other kinds of apps that you can get alerted to a warning on your phone. Weather radio is a good standby because we always tell people to have multiple ways to get warnings, because a cell phone tower can be taken out by a storm and all of a sudden your phone is worthless when it comes to getting information. So weather radio is a good way to get that information, and of course television and radio. But I think when it comes to flash flood warnings, it's one of those things that, yeah, it's just flash flood warning. Now, if it's tornado warning, yeah, that's going to get me excited and interested and concerned, but a lot of people just say it's a flash flood warning. And for some, it's not an issue. It's often, it's a situation where it's people away from their home. I mean, yeah, you can have some flooding in your home, but it's when we start to get into the situation where it's really dangerous is when people try to drive through flooded roadways.
Now, what should people do if there is a flash flood warning in their area? What do you recommend individuals do?
Well, I mean, you get to high ground if you're in an area that is susceptible to a lot of flooding. Now, that's not so much a case around here because we don't have big changes in elevation. So I think the one important thing to know is that when you're driving in a flash flood warning, respect the water. And we always say, turn around, don't drown. You see a flooded roadway, just turn around, don't try to drive through it. And that's where most of the fatalities occur in flash flooding are people trying to drive through a flooded roadway. And in some cases, the road closed sign is already there, and they still go around and thinking, well, I got a truck, I can do this is why I have a truck, so I can go through weather like this. But you don't know how deep the water is, you don't know how fast it's moving, and you don't know the condition of the road underneath. So it's quite possible you get out there, all of a sudden the road has washed away, your vehicle stalls, and then you fill up with water and get swept away, and that's how the fatalities happen. So turn around, don't drown, respect the high water, and just don't try to drive through it.
Great insight and expertise as always. Eyewitness News Chief Meteorologist Wayne Hart, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure to be here, Noah.
Joining us now is Nick Raber, head of the Evansville Fire Department's Special Operations. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for asking us.
So for viewers at home who might not be aware, what does the Fire Department's Special Operations Unit do?
So our Special Operations Unit, we have 4 different teams. We have our water rescue team, which is composed of divers and swift water team members. We also have a rope team for rope rescues. We have a hazardous materials technicians team that responds to hazardous material incidents, and we also have a trench and structural collapse team.
So we've been talking in this episode of Newsmakers about flash flooding in particular, and I'm just curious about your work there, particularly when do you guys get into action or into gear when there is like a flash flood watch or warning that's issued?
So our members on our dive team are really good about training year round. They're in the local lakes and ponds and even on the river some, training throughout the year. But what really happens is whenever we go into a watch, our guys will go and check the gear just a little bit more thorough than they normally do on their daily checks, make sure everything's there. Run the equipment again, even though it might have already been ran earlier that week, they'll run it again, make sure everything's ready to go just in case we do get that call.
So then when a warning gets issued, let's say over the city, there's a flash flood warning or a flash flood emergency, do you all get on high alert or what are the next steps for you and your team?
So a lot of times we already know where the troubled areas are in Evansville that we respond to on a regular basis. But when we go into a warning or we really start getting a heavy downfall rain, we'll go ahead and get the gear and we'll stick it next to the fire trucks or the trucks that they're going to be responding to, because it's possible they'd be out on another run, a medic run, a house fire, and then get dispatched for a water rescue. And so that way they've already got the gear with them and they can just respond from that incident to another one instead of having to come back. Time and time again, when we get these flash flood warnings, you might be gone from the station for a couple of hours just making runs back and forth between wires down, vehicles stuck in water, and so on.
You mentioned some of these problem areas in the city. When it comes to flash flooding, where in Evansville are some of those troubled spots?
So it all depends a lot of times on how much rain we've had in the past couple of days, how hard it's raining at the time. But normally our viaducts are our biggest one. The Ray Becker Parkway, it has a tendency to flood down there, and then the Virginia Street Viaduct. We've also seen it on First Avenue when we just get a torrential downfall of rain, it actually flooding over. Back in June, when we had the torrential floods, it was reported, I think, close to 4 inches at the airport, but other areas of Evansville reported 6 inches. But First Avenue was completely flooded over. I know we made a bunch of runs as far as stranded motorists in high water then.
And we saw those images from neighborhoods and even at that Target there on First Avenue of some of the parking lot that was actually underwater. How often has this, I know you might not be able to put your thumb right on it, but how often of a reoccurrence is this? Like, are you preparing for the flash flooding? Is this something that you're continuously training for? How often do you think you respond to calls every year?
So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, our members train year round on that, but we'll go ahead and especially concentrate our efforts in fall a lot of times when we're not making those flash floods. Training on using the equipment again. That way we stay focused on our skills year in and year out on it. But it seems about normally 70% of our runs that we make as far as water rescues are vehicles in high water. And a lot of times what we're running into is people will ignore the barricades. They'll think that they can just drive through it as long as they go in the center. And a lot of people don't realize all it takes is a foot of water to float a small car and up to 18 inches of water to float a bigger truck like a pickup truck or a high profile SUV.
Are you ever responding out in the river bottoms, Union Township? Do you ever make your way out there? I'm thinking of Old Henderson Road, which often floods when the river gets up.
So that's actually covered by Perry Township Fire Department, and we have a good mutual aid agreement with them. We work well with them. If they would call us, we'd be more than happy to help respond down there, but normally they take care of it. But you do get a lot of people, as I stated earlier, they'll drive around the barricades and then they drive into the high waters. And especially if you do that in the city of Evansville, you're not realizing that when you're driving through the high water, there's a good chance of sewage that's actually in that water because all the sewers are so far backed up that it's actually flowing water back out on the streets. So if you have to get out, you might be walking through raw sewage actually to get out of your vehicle. And a lot of people don't realize too, when we get a high occurrence of rain, that manhole covers will pop off. So if you're walking out there or you're requiring us to walk in to get you, there's a chance that there's a missing manhole cover and you could end up falling straight in and into the sewer system.
Which presents its own challenges, walking through raw sewage or right stepping into an unsealed manhole cover. I'm curious too, Nick, if a flash flood warning is issued, you mentioned rescuing people, often from their vehicles. Are there any other things, any other calls that you see often besides rescuing people from their vehicles? Are you responding to, homes to help with residents? What are some of the other occasions?
We have responded to that before where people will tell us that maybe they've lost power and their basement's starting to fill up full of water. And so what we tell people is if that's the case, just if you can safely leave your house, because if you have a basement that's filling up full of water and it gets to a certain level and gets to where the circuit breaker panel is at, the last thing you want to do is possibly take a chance of getting electrocuted or walking down into that basement to try to shut down the breaker panel yourself. And that's water and electricity, as we all know, don't ever mix. So it's just using good common sense. If your vehicle is parked out in the road and you know you live in a low-lying area and it's going to be a rainfall that's going to be pretty heavy, maybe pull your vehicle up into your driveway. That way you're not letting it sit out in the street and possibly get waterlogged.
So what is your parting message, your advice for people if there is a flash flood warning in place? What's the best thing that they could do to be proactive? Like you just mentioned, maybe pulling your vehicle up in the driveway. What are some other things they could do?
If you have to, plan your route out. We all have our routes we like to take. But sit there and look at possibly alternative routes that way and give yourself plenty of time. That way when you're driving there, if the water is over the road or they have it shut down, you have time to take an alternative route and get to your destination safely. So many times though, people will drive into it and it creates, like we already talked about, you're exposing yourself to possibly walking through raw sewage, but then you could completely ruin your car, getting water into the engine. And then we have to take time away from making other emergencies in the city for preventable things, such as somebody that's drove off into high water. And a lot of times when we go out there, we end up tearing up some of our gear, which is over $1,000 for a dry suit. So again, it's a high occurrence of cost for us and to the city and the taxpayers to go out and do something that was completely preventable by turning around and not driving through high water.
Nick Raber with the Evansville Fire Department, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for asking us.
Next, we're joined by Jonathan Whittam, the Deputy Director of the Indiana Department of Homeland Security and head of a new task force announced by Governor Braun just a few weeks ago. Jonathan, thank you so much for making time for us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So first, I wanted to get into kind of some of the news of the day. Obviously, this new task force that was announced by the governor. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that entails and what you're going to be heading up?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is a group of highly qualified experts in the field of public safety. So we have members who are fire chiefs, EMS directors, 911 directors, and the task force itself will be 10 members, including 2 state agency folks, myself and Michael Watkins from the Integrated Public Safety Commission, and then experts designed to get in the room, talk about this issue, and identify the current status of our emergency alert system in Indiana, any gaps that might be out there, and then how are we going to collectively fix any issues that we identify.
And we know that's so important, right? After watching the news play out in Texas, from around July 4th, absolutely heartbreaking scenes there. So obviously very, very timely. But I'm curious too, you mentioned these emergency alert systems. Do you have any idea, like the history behind them, of those emergency systems that you're going to be ending up checking on here in the state?
The technology for these systems and for alerting in general is always evolving. But I think what a lot of us think of when we're thinking about emergency alerts for weather issues are the tornado sirens that we hear so often in our communities. And in Indiana, we test those every Friday at 11 o'clock. But the consistent nature of the messaging and the layered approach that we've been trying to employ the last few years is what we really want to focus on. So instead of being in the mindset that if there's an issue, I'm going to hear a tornado warning, a tornado siren go off, I want everyone to understand that you may not be in a geographic location that has one of those sirens. And so for that reason, we want to focus on those alerts that come to your phone, those alerts that come to email, on social media, all these different layers of messaging. And that technology, like I said, is always evolving. So we want to look at what's out there now. What may be available? Is it something that we have access to here in the state of Indiana? Is it something that we need access to, and how do we get it?
And I'm curious too, Jonathan, to your knowledge, have there been any specific issues with emergency alerts that you're aware of that the state has experienced?
No specific alerts right now. So what we want to do is we want to dig into that. Is there an issue that is well known or known in certain parts of the state that we can address? Is the system good but not great, and how do we get it to great? And so those are the questions that we want to ask these experts. I think we have a lot of very interested stakeholders in this group as well. So the National Weather Service, we have GIS mapping, we have a lot of different folks from different sectors that want to know what comes out of this task force. And so we're excited to kind of dig in and ask those tough questions and then figure out how we go from good to great.
Very, very important work. You know, the National Weather Service and NOAA have had their funding reduced recently. Is there any concern that might have an impact on the issuing of alerts? And what do you tell someone at home who's watching who might be concerned about that funding cut, particularly when it relates to the state of Indiana sharing their alerts?
Yeah, I understand there may be some concern over that. We have an amazing partnership with the National Weather Service here in Indianapolis and all over the state, the different offices in other states around us, and we have no concerns right now that any of this alerting would be impacted by budget issues that everyone is experiencing. And so, if there are gaps that we identify specifically in Indiana, then we will work to identify funding sources to fill those gaps, whether those are state funds or grant funds. But the alerting itself is, we've been assured, and we've seen it even recently. The National Weather Service has really been pushing these alerts, especially since the tragedy in Texas. And so, again, that multi-agency, multi-layer approach is what we want. We don't want to rely on one single point of failure with the system. And so the state has a role, National Weather Service, local communities, emergency management agencies, we all have a role in this.
And Jonathan, here we are, obviously, in Evansville. We are on the Ohio River. Wanted to ask you about the floodplains in the state and how they've been changing, you know, particularly for some of these river towns and other areas that are on bodies of water. Could you just kind of dive into a little bit about what the floodplains are and how they've been changing maybe in recent years?
Sure. We have a couple of different groups that watch these areas very closely. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources is one of the agencies that helps identify and manage some of those floodplains and floodways. And then obviously FEMA. They have maps that are reviewed and redrawn periodically. What we've noticed here in Indiana is that flooding is the largest threat from a natural hazard standpoint to the state. And that's been that way for many, many years. But over the course of time, streams change direction and rivers change the amount of water that they can hold, their capacity. And so flooding is and will remain one of the biggest threats to our state. And so it's something that we want to focus on with this system, with counties that are impacted maybe more than others. So to your point, along the Ohio River, we have a lot of bodies of water in Indiana, and we know generally where that water is going to rise. And so to be able to focus on those communities with specific technology or different types of alerting systems, I think will be very beneficial moving forward.
It's great insight. Jonathan Whittam, the Deputy Director of the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, thank you for making time. We really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks to all of our guests for giving us important information about flash flooding and the emergency alert systems in our area. I'm Noah Alatza, Chief Communications Officer for the University of Evansville. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.